reminder to turn off anything that makes noise. And I want to just let you know that this is the second of 4 recitals, lecture recitals. The third one, the next one, will happen January 24th. He just told me. It's January 24th. Similar to this one. So that will be the third. And then if you'll join me in a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for every blessing that thou hast given to us, especially tonight for this gift of this recital, for this music, for the preparation that Brother Thomas has put into it, for his desire to bless us with the beauty and the knowledge and understanding of it. We ask thee to bless him, and we ask thee to bless us, that we may be open and receptive to appreciate and learn. We're thankful above all for the gospel of Jesus Christ and for our Savior, and we pray that his spirit and thy spirit may be with us. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome everyone. Please come on down if you need to maybe move in a little at the top. The front row of course is always available. It's a Mormon school, but yeah, you can just take a minute to sit down. You just heard Opus 15 number 1 of Chopin's Nocturnes. And if you were at my last recital, you heard this definition that a nocturne is usually a piece suggesting night, usually quiet and meditative in character, but not invariably so, as in the case of what you just heard, right? We had a moment there where suddenly everything went berserk, right? And the character of several of these nocturnes tonight is both virtuosic and dramatic in comparison with Chopin's earlier works, as well as certainly in comparison with those of John Field, the originator of the genre earlier in the 19th century. So first question, what is virtuosity? I need to explain that. It is an ability demonstrated by a virtuoso, which comes from the Latin virtus, or excellence or worth. So a virtuoso is a person of notable accomplishment, and particularly in music, a person of extraordinary technical skill. We have a little more background on this idea of virtuosity. In ancient Greece, the cities would hold male competitions in acrobatics, conjuring, public reciting, blowing the trumpet, acting out scenes from Homer's epics. I will not be doing any of those things tonight, by the way. And the winners would have been praised as virtuous or full of manly virtues. So in Chopin's Paris of the early 1830s, the virtuosos were pianists, and their technical skill was the thing that was on display. We learn a little bit about how Chopin's younger years worked out in this letter from his father, Nikolai. He said in 1831, "The mechanism of playing took you little time. Your mind was busier than your fingers. If others spend whole days struggling with the keyboard, you rarely spent an hour at it. Must be nice." I wish I could say the same, but no. So what did Chopin actually think of all these other pianists who were hanging around Paris? Well, we get a pretty good idea when he said, "I really don't know whether any place contains more pianists than Paris, or whether you can find anywhere more donkeys and virtuoso. Is there a difference?" So he had pretty strong ideas about that. The great German poet Heinrich Heine, whose works we know a lot from the songs of Schubert and Schumann, his early lyric poetry was set by them a lot. Heinrich Heine was also a critic and pretty famous for his acerbic wit, which you will see on display here. He described the pianists as a plague of locusts swarming to pick Paris clean. And specific pianists he had some choice words for. There was a German pianist called Dreischock. One seems to hear not one pianist, Dreischock, but Dreischock, which is 3 times 3 score of pianists, because I guess the guy was really loud. It turns out that Franz Liszt and Sigismund Thalberg had a musical duel at a countess's salon, and he referred to this as a melancholy misunderstanding. On the pianist Henri Herz, who I guess he thought was rather boring, he said he has long been dead but was recently married, which I think had some reference to an affair he was having at the time. So there was more to it than meets the eye. Then we have Friedrich Kalkbrenner, who was considered kind of the very best one. He was very polished in his technique. He couldn't miss a note. He put it this way: he's like a bonbon fallen in the mud. There's nothing wrong with it, but everyone leaves it where it lies. So a little sharp there. So many of these pianists were also composers who wrote music specifically to demonstrate their amazing technique. So you may wonder, what does this music sound like? Well, you're in luck. We have a piece here called Le Fou, Scène Dramatique, opus 136. He was just getting warmed up at 136 probably. Lots of pieces by this guy. So it is a piece that he described this way. He said it's a young pianist, it depicts a young pianist who is deceived in his first affections and becomes mad. He expresses on his pianoforte the various sensations he experiences. So let's see what a little bit of this sounds like. I won't make you listen to the whole thing, it's about 10 minutes, so we'll just listen to a bit of it. Let's see if I can get the right moment here. Here's a bit. Look out, here come the octaves. And more. Now. Okay, I think that's enough of that. So you get the idea. This would not be out of place in a silent film, if you ask me, kind of supporting, kind of melodramatic. Oops, I think I'm accidentally actually advancing this. Yeah, we had enough of that. Okay. So there's a great pianist called Charles Halle, actually German and English pianist, who met with Kalkbrenner because he wanted to take lessons from him. Kalkbrenner was kind of the leading teacher in Paris at the time. And in fact, Chopin, there's a whole other story about this, and that is that Chopin actually was introduced to him, and Kalkbrenner offered to teach him for a 3-year period. He said, you shouldn't play anything in public, you should just work with me for 3 years, and then you'll be great. And Chopin's like, no. So he declined that. He was actually kind of in doubt, but his parents were just like, why? You know, you already play better than, anyway. So Charles Halle had this experience when he went to audition for Kalkbrenner. Kalkbrenner said, oh, you're not good enough, sorry. Maybe you can work with one of my students. But then he said this, as I was about to leave him, he offered to play for me, saying that it might prove useful for me to hear him. I accepted eagerly and was full of expectation when he sat down and played a new piece of his composition entitled Le Fou, what we just heard, one of the most reasonable and dullest pieces ever perpetrated. So that was Halle's experience. Now, coincidentally, that very same day, he heard Chopin play in the evening. That same evening, I heard Chopin play and was fascinated beyond expression. It seemed to me as if I had got into another world and all thought of Kalkbrenner was driven out of my mind. I sat entranced, filled with wonderment, and if the room had suddenly been peopled with fairies, I should not have been astonished. And he said further, in listening to him, you lost all power of analysis. You did not for a moment think how perfect was his execution of this or that difficulty. You listened, as it were, to the improvisation of a poem, and were under the charm as long as it lasted. I really wish if I could time travel, that is one thing I'd want to do, is go back and hear Chopin play in one of those salons. Not recorded, of course, because he died before that was possible, but all the descriptions make it sound incredible. Heine, our favorite critic, actually had kind words, to say the least. He said, when he plays, I forget all other masters of the instrument, or mere skill, and sink into the sweet abyss of his music, into the melancholy rapture of his exquisite and profound creations. Chopin is the great and genial poet of sweet sound who should only be named with Mozart or Beethoven or Rossini. So, given this description of Chopin's style of piano playing versus Kalkbrenner's as an example of virtuosity, is there virtuosity in these nocturnes? Well, one could argue no, because none of these pieces were calculated to impress the listener with keyboard gymnastics, as was typical of his contemporaries. But you could also argue yes, because the technical approach of the contrasting dramatic sections, like the one we just heard in Opus 50, number 1, was similar to an etude, which is calculated to solve a technical problem. So I use the word invoking in the second definition, meaning it calls on for inspiration. I would not say that Chopin was setting out to write something virtuosic, but he used virtuosity to spawn, yield, contribute to, or give rise to some of his ideas in these contrasting dramatic B sections. So, what then makes his style of keyboard writing so different from his colleagues of that time? You probably haven't heard of any of his famous contemporaries, really. I don't know. How many of you knew about Kalkbrenner? Yeah. That's what I thought. There's a long list of people who probably thought of themselves as far superior to Chopin and much more famous at the time, that wrote music and thought they were going to write for the ages, but really didn't. So I have a few clues that I have kind of made from my own observations and also from research that I've done. Now, one thing I should say as a caveat is much of what I'm describing, what I'm reading about, is describing his playing. But since Chopin's playing and composition were inextricably, and that's a hard word to say, inextricably intertwined, it's very hard to say. I think that all these ideas apply equally. So first of all, I believe Chopin had an extraordinary sensitivity to the human voice and to breathing in his style of writing. So he said this in his sketch toward a piano method. He actually left a few pages unpublished of works that he would try to create a piano method but didn't finish it. And so we have a little bit of an idea of how he thought one should play the piano. He said this: "We use sounds to make music just as we use words to make language." And then to his student Mikuli, he said this about a musician who doesn't phrase correctly. He says, "It is as if someone were reciting in a language not understood by the speaker, a speech carefully learned by rote, in the course of which the speaker not only neglected the natural quantity of the syllables, but even stopped in the middle of words. The pseudo-musician shows in a similar way, by this wrong phrasing, that music is not his mother tongue, but something foreign and incomprehensible to him, and so must, like the aforesaid speaker, quite renounce the idea of making any effect upon his hearers by his delivery." And while this describes execution of phrasing, we find the same sensitivity in Chopin's composition of phrasing as well, in my opinion. Another clue we have is Chopin's sensitivity to the instrument's potential for tone color variation. First of all, we should have a little working definition of tone color. Another word for it is timbre, or what you might call the characteristic sound of a given instrument. For example, the flute has a certain color that is different from a clarinet, that is different from an oboe, and so forth. But even on an instrument like the piano or any instrument, you can have variations of tone color within the instrument itself. We might use words like bright or dark or harsh or sharp or what have you to describe them. He did not subscribe to the finger equalization theories of the Czerny school of technique espoused by Kalkbrenner and others, where they had all kinds of devices and machines to try to make all the fingers work exactly the same way. He did not agree with this, and he considered most virtuosos piano pounders to sound like barking dogs as a result of this technique. And rather, he saw each finger as individual in what it can contribute to tone color. He had this to say. Well, he had something to say, but first, we hear from his student Elise Peruzzi, where she describes his pianissimo was extraordinary. Every little note was like a bell, so clear. His fingers seemed to be without bones, but he would bring out certain effects by great elasticity. Very interesting. And then his comments again from that sketch. He said, "For a long time, players have been acting against nature by training our fingers to be all equally powerful. As each finger is differently formed, it is better not to attempt to destroy the particular charm of each one's touch, but on the contrary, develop it. Each finger's power is determined by its shape. There are many different sounds as there are fingers." So we have from his notations on pupils' copies some fingerings that he recommended. And this is just one example. In the National Edition, we see the bold type there showing Chopin's fingerings, whereas the italicized ones are simply by the editor. But on this particular passage in Opus 15, number 2, we have this particular touch with 4 and 5. And he does this in part to hold the thumb right here. But he wants what's called portato, which is where you have the arm moving separately. And of course, when you have repeating 5s and 4s this way, it will slow you down and help you find the exact tempo and touch that he wanted. So that's just an example. There's many examples like this. Clue number 3, whoops, got too fast there. Chopin's remarkably imaginative use of harmony. He advanced harmony in 5 years, more than it had probably in 50, by the 1830s. Alan Walker, the great biographer of Chopin, said that his daily keyboard contact meant that his fingers led his ears into uncharted territory. Another observer called him the Copernicus of the piano for his ability to discover heretofore unknown harmonic vistas. One example of this type of thing that is quite unique to him is what we call linear chromaticism. And just, I know this is kind of a technical term, but briefly, It has to do with the fact that chord relationships that are normally built vertically to move a certain way with root relationships move sideways, and they kind of slide around as one note slides, usually down in his case. I'll give you an example here. We have this chord, the first circled chord is this chord here, which in D flat major should go here, but instead he slides down and keeps sliding down until he's in a foreign key, A major. And then he does the same thing and is back in D flat major. And I don't think we would probably hear anything that innovative in anything by his contemporaries at the time. In fact, I hate to do this to you again, but we have another moment in the dry shot, or in the Kalkbrenner piece I think is kind of interesting. So at the end, we have, I think, an example of what you might call non-innovation. This is the coda of this piece. One more time, faster. And so on. Okay, he actually does it 3 times, so we'll just kind of keep moving on from there. But I just think that's kind of interesting. It's maybe unfair to compare one of Chopin's very best moments to one of Kalkbrenner's perhaps less inspired, but still, you get the idea. This was, his language was completely unique at the time. Let's see. So, about those dramatic B sections that invoke the virtuosity. This is a Chopin innovation and was not typical in the field nocturnes or in his earlier ones, as I mentioned. We have the first example of this in Opus 9, number 3, which, if you were at my last recital, was one of the nocturnes I played. Just to get you a flavor of that again, if you've forgotten. I'm sure you've memorized the whole thing. So, an agitato that just suddenly takes over in the middle of this piece. That was the first example of that in Opus 9, number 3. We have other examples, Opus 15, number 1, which you heard already. This one right here with that crazy con fuoco with fire section in the middle. And then we also have in Opus 15, number 2, a doppio movimento, which means twice as fast as the previous material. And this little segment, this little transition sounds something like this. Let's see, where are we starting? And it gets more exciting as it goes, but jumps into this completely different texture. And then we also have even probably the most dramatic of this set, Opus 27, number 1, which has più mosso, again, which means more motion or faster. And it sounds like this as we finish. And it gets quite a bit more dramatic than that. It just kind of starts us off with this uneasy feeling in the più mosso as it begins. Oh, I get to show you, I forgot. Okay, so here is a triple forte climax. And triple forte was not a very common dynamic marking at the time. Chopin used it quite a bit. But he says appassionato at this point. So a very dramatic moment, but it's not the only one. There's actually another one, but I can't remember if I'm showing that. I'm going to show that one later. Okay, so Opus 15 was published in 1834, first one we heard already. It was published with this charming portrait of Chopin by Pierre Roche Vigneron. looking like a dashing young man. At this point, 1834, he would have been 24 years old. And the Chopin Nocturne Opus 15 number 2 is another opera ario for the piano with this bel canto as inspiration. Bel canto is an opera style that was very melodic and full of ornamentation. It has a broken chord accompanimental pattern like we see here. Just to give you a flavor of the ornamentational style in this one. Just a ravishingly beautiful melody and ornamentation in that particular one. So another feature of this particular piece is portamento imitation. Portamento is a slide from one note to the other, especially in singing or playing a bowed string instrument. You notice missing from that is piano. Portamento is not really a thing on piano. The Italian word means carrying. But is there a soprano in the house by chance? Oh, well, what do you know? Okay. Thank you to Rebecca Piper-Busselberg, who is going to demonstrate portamento for us. And you know, who needs Maria Callas if you have Rebecca? So we're going, we're just going to move on from that. Okay.
Just to see her $1 million jewels.
Her jewels, yeah, that was $1 million right there, yeah. Okay, so she will sing just a bit of Pasta Diva from Bellini. And I'm just going to open my score. Okay, do you want to say anything about portamento?
So portamento or portamento for the voice is the basis of singing, of really, really good singing, and there's really only one school of singing, and that's good singing, is that it's always on the breath, it's legato, and it's on the file di voce, which is the thread of the voice. And when you're on the file di voce, you can have chiaroscuro, you have appoggio, these are all Italian terms for the masters. But the idea is that you can slide easily between the pitches, and it's with the breath. It's not, it's a process of understanding, just as we technically understand how the voice and all the instruments work, but then we have to forego all of that and allow the breath to move everything. And then we become just subject to music, to that voice. So here we go.
So we'll just do.
This is a little bit of Pasta Diva from Bellini's Norma, which premiered in 1831.
Right around this time.
Yes.
Do you want to just show them one portamento made from A to F? Just so to listen for it.
So it's the idea of going between, usually it happens between skips or leaps, when you fill in all the notes in between one pitch to the next. It's not written in the score. It's just stylistically known that that's what you do.
So we'll do a couple of phrases. Yeah. Thank you. So in Opus 15, number 2, Chopin sought to imitate this, and you can see it in the circled area there. Now the piano cannot actually do every single pitch in the continuum like a voice can. You can only do chromatic notes, but it tries to get that effect. So those two spots there in that particular one, so you can watch for that. I think that might be the end. Yeah, so now I'll go ahead and play Opus 15, number 2 for you. So you get a feel for this opera aria. Thank you so much. One of my very favorite nocturnes ever. Now for something completely different. Chopin wrote Opus 15, number 3 in 1833, a few years after the other two. And as you can see already, the left hand and the right hand are quite different. It's very austere in comparison to these elaborate, operatically inspired pieces. We have this interesting tidbit, perhaps dubious, but we'll take it. It says, they say that the day after he attended a performance of Hamlet at the theater, he wrote the Nocturne, Opus 15, number 3, and inscribed it at the cemetery. But when it came to having it printed, he erased the inscription saying, let them work it out for themselves. Now, key word is they say. This is perhaps apocryphal. We don't really know. What we do know is that he did attend a performance of Hamlet in 1833. It was his second time observing it, actually. And so we do know that there is possibly some basis for it. And it has been disavowed by some scholars as almost certainly a fabrication, but is also a very famous idea that has gripped the imagination of many people ever since it has been around. We have this moment in the cemetery, of course, where Hamlet comes across the gravediggers preparing Ophelia's grave, and he finds Yorick's skull, and he starts to speculate on the nature of life and death. And this is the famous speech. And I have to thank my colleague Richard Clifford for giving a recording of this so that I didn't sound like a fifth grader trying to do an audition. Let me see here. Here we go.
Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander returned into dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not stop a bear-bearer? Imperious Caesar, dead, turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that earth, which kept the world in awe, should patch a wall to expel the winter flaw.
So his speculations in this scene, of course, are on the great and the small are brought low by death. Oh, sorry, there we go. And then Chopin's actual words on the subject of death, there are a number of things, but I thought this particular excerpt from a letter written from Vienna to his friend Jan Matuszynski were very interesting. I strolled along slowly alone, and at midnight went into St. Stephen's, the cathedral. When I entered, no one was there, not to hear the Mass, but just to look at the huge building at that hour. I got into the darkest corner at the foot of a Gothic pillar. I mean, it doesn't get more Gothic than that, really. But, I can't describe the greatness, the magnificence of these huge arches. A coffin behind me, a coffin under me. Only a coffin above me was lacking. A mournful harmony all around. I never felt my loneliness so clearly. In one translation, that last line is rendered this way. I never felt so clearly as an orphan, which I think is really interesting. So there is no question that he had a lot of morbid thoughts in his young life. So what are the characteristics of Opus 15, number 3? It does not have a rolling broken chord accompanimental pattern and a bel canto melody, as I mentioned already. And it does have a dance rhythm, which we call a kujawiak. Mostly the second measure that you see there, 1 and 2, 3, 1 and 2, 3. You'll see that quite a bit. It's a slow, elegant kind of dance. We'll see the dotted rhythm at the end of the piece. And it has this left-hand dance style accompaniment instead of the rolling bass. So that kind of thing. Almost, I won't say a waltz because it's a mazurka-like dance, but it's in 3, and we feel the dance lilt to it. It has a very morose and searching character, which is brought out by the fact that the opening melodic figure sounds like a question, and it repeats 4 times with this long F at the answer that gives the impression of no answer, but always circles back to the question. It also has this alien mode flavor where we're leaving out the leading tone. We have this quality instead of that F sharp in this key. And so here's the question. And there's the long F. Let's see if I can get that to, there they are, the long Fs. And it comes back again, as I say, 4 times. It also has the question becoming more complicated as it develops into more chromatic and rhythmically insistent versions with a dramatic outburst. I'll just give you the outburst so you know what to listen for. So that's, I guess, the frustration of not getting an answer, possibly, to this particular question. And then we have, as it transitions to the middle section, we have that repeating note in the bass, kind of like the high F that we had before. No answer. And then it's marked religioso sottovoce, and we have a chorale, or an appeal to God at this point, asking the question again. Sottovoce means undertone or under the breath, so like a prayer. And then it comes back in the final section to the question, again, not answered, these repeating notes, sforzando, over and over and over again. So now, Opus 15, number 3. Thank you. Do you think he got his answer? You think so? We got a G major chord anyway. That's worth something. Yeah. Okay, I don't know. When I first started working in this piece, I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. It was like, what? There's no nocturne in this. But it's one of my favorites now, honestly. Finally, Opus 27. We have a pair of nocturnes written in 1835 and published at the same time by in Leipzig and London. It's the first time that Chopin publishes a pair of nocturnes instead of three, and this is actually the pattern that continues from here on out. He always publishes in pairs, all the way to Opus 62. The English publisher Wessel added the subtitle Les Plaintifs, or The Complaints. These are the sort of things that the publishers did to increase sales, to give it some kind of character. It totally fits the first one, doesn't fit the second one at all, but whatever. So some 19th century commentary, which I think is really quite rich. We have this comment about Opus 27, number 1, from Jan Klenczynski, a description of a calm night at Venice, where after a scene of murder, the sea closes over a corpse and continues to serve as to mirror the moonlight. By the way, this is not what it is about, but it's kind of a cool idea. James Huneker, with the possible exception of the C minor nocturne, Opus 48, number 1, which you'll hear next time, this one in the somber key of C sharp minor is the great essay in the form. It's quite a substantial piece. And then Henry Fink embodies a greater variety of emotion and more genuine dramatic spirit on 4 pages than many operas in 400, and possibly Kalkbrenner in 40, right, to continue that theme. Some of the notable features, we have in the left hand this opening with very wide spacing, which kind of suggests almost like an open abyss. So there's no key, well, there's a key, but there's no major or minor indication in the very beginning, so it's left very ambiguous. And of course, the first 3 notes of the melody don't really help clarify that too much. We also have this piumoso, which we've already talked about. The continued wide spacing in the left hand. Wish me luck on this one. If you look at the left hand, yeah, we'll do it later. But it's something he continues throughout this entire piece. And then we have some Polish patriotism on display with this D flat major dance. And one wonders if the whole thing isn't a commentary about his being isolated as in Paris, away from his homeland. And then we have a second anguished climax with this left-hand cadenza. Sounds like this. And so on. Again, kind of operatic in the character there, kind of like a recitative, very dramatic. Okay, Opus 27, number 1. Thank you so much. Our last Nocturne of the evening would be Opus 27, number 2, which is probably the most famous of the nocturnes after Opus 9, number 2, which I played last time, and justly so. It is an absolutely gorgeous piece of music by any standard. Some of its commentary, James Honecker, a song of the sweet summer of two souls. There's a lot of duet material in here. A profusion of delicate fioriture, which is embellishment, and Hugo Leichtentritt, simply achingly beautiful, which I think is a very good description. A few features. It departs from the ABA sort of three-part coming back to the beginning idea, and instead presents three iterations of the main melody with increasingly elaborate ornamentation. André Gide explains this characteristic of Chopin's writing. Chopin seemed to be constantly seeking, inventing, discovering his thought little by little. This kind of charming hesitation of surprise and delight ceases to be possible if the work is presented to us no longer in a state of successive formation, but as an already perfect, precise, and objective whole. So he seems to always be improvising as he goes. The duet texture in the right hand shows up fairly early. Sounds something like this after the beginning of the first phrase. Throughout much of the piece, we have this duet texture. And we have another example of this in the coda. We have this imitation between voices going back and forth, which I'll just demonstrate briefly. So forth. A beautiful duet. And we have this mazurka-like dance element which sort of unexpectedly shows up here and there in the piece. Another nod to his homeland. And then finally, we have a very long, winding coda after a ending that sounds pretty ending-like. The end. Not really. Another example of linear chromaticism. And he keeps doing this for a whole page, actually, kind of finishing it off. And here we have the autograph. This is what his handwriting looked like. You can enjoy that while I play Opus 27, number 2. Thank you.